Have you ever looked into a mirror and felt a chill? Not from the reflection staring back at you, but from a flicker of something else, a moment that shouldn't be, a world that took a different turn? Imagine a historian, a man whose life is built on knowing what happened, suddenly confronting a history that didn't happen and realizing he's the only one who can see the difference. Our story begins in the swampy, bustling, often overlooked Washington, D.C. of the early 1830s, where the ghost of a future tragedy begins to rewrite the present. This is the Lincoln Reflection. Close your eyes, let the gaslight fade, and step with us into a past where a single touch can shatter a nation's memory. Past of schoolbooks, but the grimy, documented, ink-stained reality. Washington, D.C. in the early 1830s was a city still finding its feet, an odd mix of muddy streets, grand marble intentions, and the suffocating humidity of a former swamp. But for Elias, its most magnetic corner was the small, dusty back room of the National Archives on Pennsylvania Avenue, tucked away before the structure was even properly grand. Here, surrounded by the smell of decaying paper and the silence of centuries, he found his only peace. Elias was a meticulous man, slight of build, with eyes perpetually strained from reading faint scripts by weak gaslight. His current obsession was the Civil War, specifically the final, tragic act, Lincoln's assassination. A curious choice of subject, given the war was still decades in the future, but Elias found himself drawn to the man he knew, from his research, would one day be the 16th president. He wasn't researching the man's life yet, but the moment he was stolen from history, the fateful night at Ford's Theater in 1865. To his peers, he was an eccentric, a man focused on a future event that seemed utterly impossible in this time of General Andrew Jackson's fiery, contentious presidency. He was a ghost in his own time, the only man alive who remembered the country that died for its greatness. One sweltering afternoon, searching for a completely unrelated document, Elias stumbled upon a crate, forgotten in a damp corner. Inside, wrapped in brittle sacking, was an antique, oval wall mirror. It was framed in dark, intricate mahogany, and its glass was old, wavy, and speckled with age. It felt cold to the touch, unnaturally so in the humid air. The moment Elias lifted it, a profound sense of wrongness washed over him, like a missed heartbeat. He hung it on the wall in his small, private study, intending to clean it later. When he finally looked into its depths, what he saw made him gasp. It wasn't his reflection at first. For a bare, chilling second, the glass showed him a different room. It was brighter, far more richly furnished than his modest study, and in the background, he saw a man in a long black coat, his face obscured by shadow, leaning over a desk. The air in the reflection felt heavier, charged with a purpose Elias couldn't name. Then, the true horror of the reflection snapped into focus. Behind the dark-coated man, hanging prominently on the wall, was a portrait. It was Abraham Lincoln, but not the tired, bearded man of the history books Elias knew. This Lincoln was vital, older, with lines of wisdom etched deep around his eyes, standing tall with a look of calm triumph. It was the face of a man who had lived long past 1865. This was the reflection of the original timeline, the history Elias knew to be true, showing a glimpse of a different future within it. Elias stumbled back, the stool beneath him scraping loudly on the wooden floor. He blinked, scrubbed his eyes, and looked again. Now, it was just him, pale, trembling, reflected in a common, dusty antique mirror. He dismissed it instantly. The heat, the stress, the endless dry ink. It had to be a hallucination. Yet, the image of that living Lincoln, a history that defied all his research, lodged in his mind like a shard of glass. He walked toward the mirror, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He had to know. He reached out, his fingertip brushing the cold, slick surface. The moment he made contact, a violent, silent jolt ran through him. The gaslight in the room flickered, casting erratic shadows. In the street outside, the distant clatter of a carriage suddenly ceased, replaced by a strange, echoing silence. Elias snatched his hand back, his mind reeling. He felt dizzy, unbalanced. He looked around his study, then out the window at the familiar, muddy street. Everything looked the same, yet the silence outside felt deep, somehow final. His skin crawled. He had just seen a future that shouldn't exist, and he had touched the barrier between it and his own reality. He had an awful, immediate certainty. Something had changed. The Lincoln reflection was more than a hallucination. It was a window, and his touch had just reached through time. The next morning, the sense of wrongness clung to Elias like the damp sea air. He tried to shake off the strange event, attributing the silence outside to a momentary lull in city traffic. But when he arrived at the archives, a subtle shift in the world became undeniable. His friend, Mr. Arthur Davies, a fellow historian and keeper of the congressional records, greeted him with a puzzled look. "Morning, Elias. You seem preoccupied. Did you finally finish that treatise on? Wait, what was that subject you were so focused on?" Elias frowned. "The treatise on the assassination of President Lincoln, Arthur. The events of April 14th, 1865. Arthur's brow furrowed further. "Lincoln? The fellow from Illinois?" "Elias, he's barely a blip on the national radar. A one-term congressman, isn't he? Why in heaven's name would you be writing about his assassination? In 1865? That's over 30 years away. You must mean the attempted attack on Jackson years ago." A cold, heavy knot formed in Elias's stomach. A one-term congressman. That wasn't right. Lincoln was the great, tragic martyr of the Civil War. He was the president who saved the Union. Arthur was looking at him as if he'd lost his mind. The archives felt wrong. Elias walked to the shelf where the historical records of the future presidency should have been, but in this new, cold reality, only minor political notes remained. The mirror had done its work, and this was the price: a diminished America. Elias realized he was no longer in the original timeline. He was now in a new one, Timeline Alpha, where Lincoln had survived the war, but was a vastly less significant figure. Elias played it off, forcing a weak smile. "My apologies, Arthur. A momentary confusion. I meant the political turmoil surrounding the slavery issue. A preoccupation, I'll admit." Later, Elias pored over his own research notes. The folders were all there. The presidency of Abraham Lincoln, the Gettysburg Address, Ford's Theater. But as he read his own meticulously penned documents, the narrative itself was subtly altered. The Gettysburg Address now seemed to be a simple, well-received speech given by Lincoln as a congressman, praising the dedication of a new cemetery, but lacking the profound, nation-defining resonance Elias remembered. The papers on the assassination were the most chilling. They were now filled with corrections and crossed-out phrases in his own handwriting. "Never occurred. Survived the war. History diverges here." He rushed back to his study, the oval mirror glinting mockingly in the afternoon light. He stood before it, his reflection appearing normal. He stared, searching for the vibrant, alive Lincoln. Nothing. He thought of Arthur's words. Barely a blip. The world had changed because of his touch. In the original timeline, his obsession, Lincoln, was a colossal historical figure. In this world, the one he had just helped rewrite, Lincoln was a historical footnote. The unshot president in the reflection was the catalyst, a different, better destiny for the man, but a jarring, alien history for the world. Elias had touched the mirror and, in a blink, the world had lost its greatest tragedy and its most iconic hero. The Civil War was still a cloud on the horizon, but the man destined to lead the nation through it was now diminished, his legacy a whisper. He looked at his hand, the fingers that had brushed the cold glass. They felt heavy, burdened with an impossible, silent knowledge. He was the only living vessel of the truth, the memory of a greatness the world no longer possessed. He knew he would have to touch it again. Elias spent a sleepless night devising a cautious plan. He was a historian, so he approached the anomaly as a historical experiment. He would make minimal, controlled contact with the mirror, a gentle tap with a stylus perhaps, and immediately check for the resulting change in the present. He wasn't seeking to undo the first change yet. He was seeking to understand the mirror's rules. The mirror, hanging innocently in his study, had returned to showing only his own agitated reflection. He approached it with a thin, brass letter opener, a tool of his trade. He held his breath, extended the opener, and tapped the mirror's center. Clink. The shock was minor this time, a brief, high-pitched ringing in his ears and the smell of ozone in the air. He quickly scanned the room, then rushed out. He needed a neutral, public gauge. He ran to the Library of Congress. He sought out the section on American theater. The original history, the one Elias held true in his heart, was irrevocably tied to Ford's theater. That night in 1865, John Wilkes Booth, the famous actor and Confederate zealot, had used his intimate knowledge of the theater to gain access to the presidential box. If the world had truly shifted, had the building itself changed its legacy? He pulled a massive, leather-bound volume titled Prominent American Playhouses. He flipped through the pages, his heart thudding. He found the entry for Ford's theater. This was the test of the second shift. The description was there, the layout, the year it was built. But the text was starkly different. There was no mention of a presidential box, no mention of the play Our American Cousin, and no mention of the great tragedy. Instead, the entry spoke of a brief but brilliant career as a music hall, ultimately closed down in 1866 after a fire caused by a carelessly discarded cigar during a performance of Hamlet. Elias closed the book, his hand trembling. The building itself was eliminated from the historical stage a year after the assassination was supposed to have happened. The events were not simply negated. They were replaced by mundane, unrelated events that still preserved a kind of historical echo. A fire instead of a bullet. The physical location of the crime had been purged from the record. The ghost of Ford's theater was erased, a necessary architectural correction for the timeline he had created. He sank onto a nearby bench, the reality of his predicament settling in. The mirror wasn't simply showing him an alternate future. It was a dial, and his touches were turning it, creating cascading, unpredictable changes in the past that led to his present. The unshot Lincoln was the massive consequence. The fire at Ford's was a subtle, structural change designed to eliminate the scene of the non-crime. He decided he needed a clearer picture of the other side. He returned to his study and sat before the mirror, not to touch, but to observe. He stared intently, focusing on the dark glass. He focused on the memory of the previous day, the reflection of the older, vital Lincoln. He pressed his palms against his temples, trying to recapture the moment of the first violent jolt. He saw it again. A faint, internal glow began in the center of the glass. The reflection of his study shimmered, growing hazy. Then, the other world began to bleed through. The dark-coated man was still there, his back to the viewer, but this time, the man moved. He stood, and a shadow fell across the large portrait of the unshot Lincoln. The shadow was long, thin, and strangely defined. The shadow of a man standing with his arm outstretched, holding something long and slim, like a walking cane or a pistol. The sight lasted only a second before his own agitated face swam back into view. Elias realized the true danger. The reflection wasn't a peaceful alternate history. It was a live moment. Someone in that other, better world, where Lincoln lived, was standing near the great man's portrait, and they were holding something that looked like a weapon. The assassination, he feared, was not prevented. It was merely delayed. The chilling sight in the reflection, the shadow holding the phantom weapon, redefined Elias's entire mission. It was no longer about historical curiosity. It was about preventing a tragedy he alone knew was coming, even in a different timeline. The living, older Lincoln was still in danger. He had to delve deeper, but he needed a name, a clue, a connection between the worlds. He returned to his archives room, now utterly convinced that his research on 1865 was a kind of supernatural pre-memory that the mirror was systematically erasing. He pulled out the original, unedited files on John Wilkes Booth, the man who was now, in this new reality, an obscure actor whose name was mentioned in a single, short theater review in an old newspaper. No notoriety, no great tragedy tied to him. He wanted to see the man's face, to find the dark zealotry that history had written for him. As Elias was poring over a police sketch of the conspirators, his hand brushed against a loose sheet of paper tucked inside the folder. It was old, but the ink was remarkably fresh, not the sepia tone of 1865. It was a note, written in an elegant, looping script that was vaguely familiar. The note read, "The reflection is not a window to the past, but a door to a delayed fate. The man who missed his mark will find another. Look to the one whose life was saved on the platform. The mirror's touch gives him new motive." Elias's breath hitched. The note was an instruction, a warning, and a direct acknowledgement of the mirror and its power. Who had written it? Who else knew? He looked closer at the looping script. It was a hand he knew well, a hand that signed receipts and internal documents daily. Arthur Davies's script. His friend, the one who couldn't remember Lincoln's significance, had apparently written this chilling, cryptic note. It was a fragment of the original Arthur, a desperate message left behind before the timeline shift had re-scrambled his memory. This confirmed Elias's isolation. He wasn't the only one who had known the truth, but he was the last. The note directed him to the one whose life was saved on the platform. Elias immediately understood the reference, but he had to check his altered reality. In the true history, John Wilkes Booth had been part of a larger plan to kill not just Lincoln, but also Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William Seward. The note must refer to Johnson or Seward, someone else whose assassination was meant to happen on that same night. He rushed to the archives of the current government, pulling the records for the Secretary of State, William H. Seward. He found a medical report from late 1865. The original history stated Seward was brutally attacked by a co-conspirator, Lewis Powell, but survived the knife wounds. In this new world, the report was different. Seward had been injured in a severe carriage accident on his way home, breaking his arm and jaw. He survived, but the nature of his injury was a horrific accident, not an assassination attempt. Elias had his clue. The note said the mirror's touch gave the saved man a new motive. The initial shift had saved Seward's life from Powell's knife, replacing the attack with a carriage accident. He then checked on the original assassin. Booth, the historical zealot, was the most likely candidate for the man who missed his mark. Elias knew he had to look closer at the reflection and find the true target. The new potential suspect, Secretary of State William H. Seward, was a public figure, easily traceable, even in the 1830s. Elias spent the next 2 days obsessively tracking his movements and public appearances, determined to find a connection to the ominous shadow in the mirror. He learned that Seward, in this earlier era, was an ambitious New York State senator, already a sharp critic of the expansion of slavery, a position that put him in conflict with many in D.C. under President Jackson. Returning to his study, Elias stood before the oval glass. He had to be bold. He needed to know if the shadow he saw was indeed Seward and what the weapon was for. This time, he didn't use an object. He removed his glove, took a deep breath, and placed his entire palm flat against the cold surface of the mirror. The resulting change was immense, a silent, internal thunderclap that rattled his teeth. The gaslight flared, then dimmed entirely, plunging the room into shadow. Outside, the sounds of the city seemed to rush away, replaced by a sudden, pervasive, unnerving sound, the rhythmic, distant drumming of a massive military march. Elias rushed to the window. This was timeline beta. The air smelled faintly of gunpowder and fear. The muddy street outside was now paved with cobblestones. A massive formation of Union soldiers marched past, their uniforms faded and mud-splattered. They were marching north, a look of grim defeat etched on their faces. Elias froze. He knew the history of the Civil War intimately. The Union Army, under the leadership he remembered, had never looked like this, never marched north in defeat. He looked at a nearby poster stapled to a lamppost. The print was stark. The Treaty of Richmond, 1864. The great struggle is over. A new Southern Confederacy is formed. The mirror had brutally corrected itself. He had not only ensured Lincoln was unshot, he had also inadvertently created a new, devastating history, a Confederate victory. Lincoln, the man who was supposed to save the Union, had, in this timeline, been merely a footnote, a minor politician, and without his decisive, later leadership, the war was lost. His attempt to ensure Lincoln's survival had been the very thing that doomed the nation. He was the architect of a splintered America. He ran back to the mirror, desperate to see the reflection of the new world he'd created. As the vision bled through, his heart plummeted. The study was darker, the room grander, filled with heavy, dark wood. The portrait was still there, the older, vital, unshot President Lincoln. But the portrait was subtly altered. It was now framed with a black mourning sash. And then he saw the man, the dark-coated figure. He stood in the foreground, his face finally visible. It was not Seward. It was a man Elias did not recognize, a man with a stern, angular face, dressed in the formal, funereal wear of a high-ranking official. The man held a cane, not a pistol, and he was looking at the portrait with a look of intense, bitter sorrow. On the desk in front of him lay a newspaper. Elias strained to read the headline, the words swimming in the wavy glass. The headline was devastating. President Lincoln passes peacefully in his sleep, November 1864. Elias had been completely wrong. The mirror wasn't showing a delayed assassination. It was showing a natural death. A man who had survived Booth's bullet only to die a few months before the war's official end, an end he had not lived to see. The war had still been lost. The unshot Lincoln had not lived to save the Union. The man in the reflection, the new, unknown figure, gently placed his hand on the portrait, a gesture of reverence and deep regret. Then, the reflection shattered, leaving Elias alone in the dim 1830s study, surrounded by the haunting sounds of a defeated, distant drum. Elias's intervention had saved a life only to destroy a country. Elias's mind raced with a terrible clarity. The mirror wasn't a simple window to a single alternative. It was a complex, self-correcting engine of history. Every action he took to save a life or alter a small detail resulted in a massive, unintended consequence. He had saved Lincoln from Booth, but in doing so, he had taken away the president who would have secured the Union victory. The death in November 1864, a natural death, yet still tragically premature, had led to the Treaty of Richmond and a divided America. He needed to find the man in the reflection, the new official who mourned the unshot president. He needed to understand the specifics of the timeline he had created. He focused on the details he had seen: the black sash on the portrait, the headline of the natural death in November 1864, and the look of deep, bitter regret on the unknown official's face. His current world, the 1830s, was now a strange, unstable blend. Some historical details of his original time were returning, but others remained fixed on the new, fractured future. He went back to the archives, looking for any mention of Lincoln in the political landscape of 1830 to 1835. He found a document that now had a subtle but profound difference. A letter from an anonymous Illinois legislator, written in 1832, praised the intelligence and potential of the young lawyer A. Lincoln. This letter, Elias knew, was originally a footnote. Now, it was marked with a red ink annotation in an unknown hand. Prophetic, but ultimately insufficient. Died too soon. Elias felt a cold wave of realization. The man who had written that note was someone who knew Lincoln, someone who knew of his death, and someone who existed in the 1830s. He went to find Arthur Davies, his friend, the man who had written the cryptic warning note. He found Arthur in the map room, meticulously cataloging old surveys of the D.C. layout. "Arthur," Elias said, his voice low and urgent, "I need to ask you about the Treaty of Richmond." Arthur looked up, a placid, confused expression on his face. "Richmond? Virginia, you mean? Why, the capital of the state. What treaty are you speaking of, Elias? Are you referencing some colonial land dispute?" Elias felt the familiar, crushing weight of the timeline shift. Arthur was once again ignorant of the history Elias knew. The wall of his isolation was back up. He had to assume the warning note was the only evidence of the true Arthur and the true history that remained. He returned to the archives, pulling the only copy he could find of Illinois political correspondence from the early 1830s. He searched for the anonymous writer of the letter that called Lincoln's potential insufficient. After hours of scanning, he found a signature on a similar document: Ezekiel Vance. The name meant nothing to Elias. But as he looked at the signature, the looping script was a near-perfect match for the handwriting on the warning note, the note Arthur had left him. Elias was staring at the name of the man who knew everything. Ezekiel Vance, a man from Illinois, a contemporary of the young Lincoln in the 1830s, and a man whose warning note had been left for Elias. The man whose signature matched the script on the note, a man who, in the new history, seemed to know Lincoln would die too soon. Elias realized the horrifying implication. The unknown official in the reflection, the one with the look of profound sorrow, must be Ezekiel Vance, in a future where Lincoln died and the Union was lost. Vance's motive, then, wasn't assassination, it was despair. And the saved man the note referred to? It had to be the original assassin, John Wilkes Booth. The full meaning of the original warning note finally crystallized for Elias. The reflection is not a window to the past, but a door to a delayed fate. The man who missed his mark will find another. Look to the one whose life was saved on the platform. The mirror's touch gives him new motive. The mirror hadn't just changed Lincoln's fate. It had retasked John Wilkes Booth. Booth, the actor, was the man whose life was saved on the platform, saved from the gallows and historical infamy that would have followed the successful assassination. In the new reality where Lincoln died naturally, Booth's intense zealotry and desire to act on the historical stage would not simply vanish. It would, as the note suggested, be given a new motive. The original assassin was an actor robbed of his climax, a time bomb waiting for a new target. Elias searched the 1830s D.C. theater records for any trace of John Wilkes Booth. Of course, the man was a boy at this time, but his famous actor father, Junius Brutus Booth, was active. Elias found an entry for a performance in Baltimore, only a day's travel away. The play, a new production of Julius Caesar. The cast included the elder Booth, but an obscure 14-year-old J.W. Booth was listed as an apprentice, playing a small, silent role as a Roman soldier. It was a long shot, but Elias felt a powerful pull. Booth was the central axis of the original tragedy. He had to find the boy to see if the seeds of the new, delayed fate were already planted. Elias packed a small bag and took the next stagecoach north to Baltimore. The journey was cramped and dusty. When he arrived, the theater was a modest, wooden affair, smaller and less grand than Ford's. He managed to secure a ticket for the night's performance, a seat in the upper balcony where he could observe the stage clearly. The play began. The elder Booth was a powerful presence, a man of ferocious, over-the-top emotion. But Elias's eyes were fixed on the periphery. Finally, in a scene depicting a battle, a line of young men dressed as Roman soldiers marched across the stage. There he was, a slender boy, his face stark and intense under the theatrical grease paint. John Wilkes Booth. As the scene ended and the soldiers prepared to exit, the boy paused. He wasn't supposed to. He turned his head and looked up into the darkness of the audience, his eyes, unnaturally large and bright, searching. His gaze seemed to land directly on Elias, sitting alone in the upper balcony. It was a fleeting moment, but the look on the boy's face was one of profound, almost impossible recognition. Elias felt a cold dread. How could the boy know him? Was the original history, the fate that should have been, somehow leaking into Booth's developing consciousness? Was the boy already haunted by the destiny that the mirror had stolen from him? After the performance, Elias waited near the stage door. He saw the elder Booth emerge, drunk and boisterous, surrounded by admirers. A moment later, the boy J.W. slipped out alone, his theatrical cloak wrapped tightly around him. Elias approached him. "John," he said softly. The boy stopped, his dark eyes snapping up. "How do you know my name, sir? I am a mere apprentice. I know things about you, John. Things that haven't happened yet. Things that should have happened." The boy didn't look scared or surprised, only intensely curious. He moved closer, his voice a dramatic whisper, even off stage. "Are you a phantasma? A ghost of my future fame?" "No," Elias said. "I'm a historian. And I know you were meant for a different stage, a different final act. The greatest act in American history." Booth's eyes widened, a flicker of hungry, terrifying ambition crossing his young face. "Tell me," he demanded, his voice trembling with an actor's hunger. "Tell me what great act the stars have for me, now that the other, the one that I almost feel, has been taken." Elias knew he had to redirect the energy, give the boy a new, historical target. "Your act," Elias said, leaning close, "is not one of tragedy. It is one of prevention, of saving something great, not destroying it." Booth looked at him, his face a mask of disappointment. "Saving? That is a poor drama, sir. Where is the blood, the spectacle, the final curtain?" Elias knew he had to redirect the energy, give the boy a new, historical target. "The greatest spectacle is the unwritten history, John. The history that has been erased. The history that can still be salvaged. Your target is a man named Ezekiel Vance." Elias's calculated lie to the young, hungry John Wilkes Booth was a desperate gambit. He had shifted the assassin's focus from Lincoln to Ezekiel Vance, the man who, in the new timeline, mourned a president who died too soon and a union that had lost the war. His hope was that this new target would allow Elias to communicate with Vance, the only person, besides Arthur, who seemed to have a grasp on the reality of the timeline shifts. Returning to D.C., Elias had only one lead on Vance, the old letter from the 1830s archives. He returned to his study and the mirror, more cautious now, but consumed by the need to understand Vance's role. He had to make contact with the new reality he'd created, the defeated world of 1864. He stared into the glass, focusing on the image of Vance he had briefly seen. The room, the portrait with the black sash, the newspaper headline. He concentrated, pushing the image into his mind. This time, the mirror responded without a touch. The edges of the glass began to glow a dull, smoky gray. The reflection of his study slowly faded, replaced by the room he'd seen before. The grand, dark-paneled chamber of Ezekiel Vance in 1864. Vance was there, sitting at his desk, his angular face buried in his hands. The man was in despair. A half-empty bottle of whiskey and a pistol lay on the desk. He was preparing to commit suicide. Elias pressed his face close to the glass, his voice a frantic whisper. "Vance. Ezekiel Vance, listen to me." Vance did not react. He was not meant to hear. The mirror was only a visual window. Frustrated, Elias looked around his own study. He needed to find a point of synchronicity, something that existed in both realities, both times, to transmit a message. His eyes fell on the brass letter opener he had used before. He picked it up, then looked for a similar object in the reflection. On Vance's desk, near the pistol, was a heavy, ornate silver inkwell. Elias took the letter opener and tapped the mirror directly over the image of the inkwell. The sound was not a clink but a low, resonant thud, and the mirror rippled like water. In the reflection, Vance suddenly snapped his head up, his eyes wide and fixed on the inkwell. The physical inkwell on his desk had vibrated, shaking his reality just as the first touch had shaken Elias's. Vance looked around the room, terrified. "Who's there? Who knows this place?" Elias tapped again, 3 rapid times. Tap, tap, tap. In the reflection, Vance's hand trembled as he picked up the inkwell. He looked intently at the spot where Elias's finger was pressing on the glass. "I am Elias Thorne," Elias whispered, though he knew Vance couldn't hear. He had to be clearer. He moved his finger across the glass, tracing a word in the dust that lay on the glass's surface. Booth. In the reflection, Vance stared at the glass, his brow furrowed. He dipped his finger in the inkwell and wrote a single, shaky word on the desk blotter. "Who?" Elias had a momentary bridge. He quickly wrote back, "Actor. D.C. 1830s. He is coming for you." Vance read it, and his face contorted in a mask of realization and fear. He seemed to understand the implication immediately. The timeline was unstable, and the man who was meant to kill Lincoln was now a new threat, redirected by a force Vance clearly suspected. He then wrote something long and desperate on the blotter, something Elias strained to read, his eyes burning. The true divergence was not Booth. It was the speech. The night Lincoln chose to stay. Find the letter he wrote. The one that forced his hand. Undo that decision. Before Elias could respond, the image began to swirl and fade. The drumming outside his D.C. study rushed back, louder this time. He felt the familiar, violent shift. He had made prolonged contact, and the timeline was moving again. He had received a critical clue, but at a cost. Elias snatched his hand away, the air thick with static electricity. He rushed to the window. The streets were back to their 1830s appearance. Muddy, quiet, the smells of horses and coal fires returning. The Confederate future was gone. The timeline had self-corrected back to the 1830s, but with Vance's information now locked into the historical record. He ran to his research desk. The note from Vance had indicated a new, fundamental point of historical divergence, the speech. Elias knew the original history better than anyone. He knew of Lincoln's many pivotal speeches, but the one that stood out, the one that truly saved the Union, was the Gettysburg Address in November 1863. He pulled the files. In this reality, the one he was in now, the one reset by his recent touch, the Gettysburg Address was back to being a well-received, but minor, historical speech, the one he'd read about days ago. He looked for a new document, something related to a speech that Lincoln had chosen not to give or a decision to stay. His eyes fell on a new entry in his Lincoln files, a document he had not seen before, labeled, "The Unsent Eulogy of Stephen A. Douglas, 1861." Stephen A. Douglas, Lincoln's great political rival, had died in 1861 at the start of the Civil War. In the true history, Lincoln delivered a powerful and moving eulogy, setting a tone of national unity. Elias read the Unsent Eulogy. It was a masterpiece of oratory, a call for national reconciliation. But the document contained a cover letter from Lincoln to a close friend, marked highly confidential. The letter stated that he had prepared the eulogy, but at the last minute, he had been compelled to stay in Washington due to an urgent, last-minute meeting with his Secretary of War. The eulogy was never delivered. Instead, a minor, forgettable public official read a short, perfunctory statement. The letter ended with a line that sent a chill down Elias's spine. "I fear my absence from Senator Douglas's final ceremony will be viewed as a political weakness. I should have gone. The moment demanded my presence. My decision to stay was forced upon me." The new historical divergence was clear: Lincoln's absence from Douglas's funeral. The note from Vance had been about a small, seemingly insignificant decision in 1861, a choice to stay in D.C. instead of traveling for a funeral. This decision, in a chain of cause and consequence, had diminished Lincoln's moral authority at a crucial point, leading to the gradual erosion of support and the ultimate loss of the war and his premature death in 1864. The Mirror had replaced the grand tragedy of assassination with the slow tragedy of political irrelevance. Elias looked at the cover letter, focusing on the line, "My decision to stay was forced upon me." He scanned the letter for a specific name, a reason. There was a faint, almost invisible smudge of ink near the signature line of Lincoln's friend. Elias carefully dabbed a little water on it and blotted it with a clean piece of parchment. The ink resolved slightly. It was a surname, Vance. Vance, the Illinois contemporary, the man who knew too much, the mourner of the defeated future, was the one who had contacted Lincoln's friend, the one who had forced Lincoln to stay in Washington in 1861. Elias now understood the horrifying loop. Ezekiel Vance, driven by the future defeat he knew was coming, a future created by Elias's earlier touch, had traveled back in time via his own method, perhaps a different mirror or a different effect of the one Elias had found, to ensure Lincoln survived 1865, thinking that was the key. He had succeeded in the wrong way, creating a natural, early death and a lost war. Vance's time-traveling intervention was the true, silent assassination. The great paradox was that the man who had desperately tried to save Lincoln's life had unwittingly destroyed his legacy and the Union. Elias was faced with an impossible task: to undo the deliberate, time-traveling intervention of Ezekiel Vance. He needed to find the original, untouched reality, the one where Lincoln delivered the eulogy, won the war, and was assassinated. That tragedy, he now realized, was the price of the Union's salvation. He was forced to become the guardian of the nation's necessary wound. He had to get back to the moment of divergence, 1861, the day of the Douglas funeral. He went back to the Mirror, holding the unsent eulogy letter in his hand. He looked into the glass, determined to make a deeper, more profound connection. He didn't just touch it. He pushed the corner of the Lincoln letter through the dust on the glass until the brittle paper flattened against the smooth surface. The effect was instantaneous and the most violent yet. The room dissolved around him. He felt a wrenching, sickening sensation, like falling from a great height. The smell of dust and old paper was replaced by the clatter of a printing press and the smell of fresh ink. He was no longer in his D.C. study. He was in a small, cramped print shop in Springfield, Illinois. The date on a newspaper clipping on the wall was June 5, 1861. He was not a reflection. He was physically there. This was the original timeline, seconds before it fractured. Elias's head swam. The Mirror had done more than shift the timeline. It had transported him directly to the point of greatest historical flux. The print shop was quiet, except for a young man laboring over a hand press, sweating in the summer heat. The air was thick with humidity and the metallic tang of ink. Elias cautiously approached the young man. "Excuse me, friend, can you tell me where I might find Congressman Lincoln?" The young man paused, wiping his brow. "President Lincoln, you mean? He's in the White House, sir." He left yesterday for the funeral of Senator Douglas in Chicago. Should be arriving just about now. Elias froze. President Lincoln, not Congressman. The printing press, the date, the destination. This was the original, true timeline. He had somehow used the evidence of the altered history, the unsent eulogy, to jump back to the moment before Vance's interference. But the young man had said, he left yesterday. The funeral was already in progress. The moment of divergence, the choice to stay or go, had already been made in the true history. Suddenly, the door of the shop burst open. An older man rushed in, his face frantic. It was Ezekiel Vance, but decades younger than the figure Elias had seen in the reflection. He was sweating and carrying a small, heavy bag. "I need a telegram sent immediately," Vance yelled, his eyes wild. "To Washington. To the White House. The president must return at once. I have news of a plot. A plot to sabotage the Union war effort. A plot that requires his immediate attention in the Capitol." Elias understood everything. Vance was physically present in the true timeline, desperately trying to replicate the interference, to force Lincoln to return to Washington and miss the eulogy, thus setting the chain of events that would save his life in 1865 but cost the war. His motive was pure. He knew the future, he knew the bullet was coming, and he was willing to sacrifice the eulogy to save the man. Elias lunged forward, tackling Vance to the ground before he could hand the telegram to the printer. "Vance, stop. You're going to lose the war," Elias shouted, wresting the telegram from his grip. Vance struggled, his face a mask of furious desperation. "I am saving his life, Thorne. The Union can survive the war. It cannot survive his death. I saw the reflection, too. I saw the darkness. I am fixing it." The small Springfield print shop became the unlikely battlefield for the fate of the American Union. Elias, fueled by the terrifying knowledge of the Confederate victory he had glimpsed, fought desperately against Vance, who was driven by the righteous certainty that he was saving his president's life. Vance was older, but his desperation gave him a savage strength. He bit and clawed, trying to reclaim the piece of paper that held the power to rewrite history. "You don't understand," Vance hissed, his voice hoarse. "His death creates the legend. Yes, but the legend can't fight the war. A living Lincoln is a victorious Lincoln." "No," Elias shouted back, pinning Vance's arms to the dusty floor. "A silent Lincoln is a weak Lincoln. He needed that eulogy to unify the nation. He needed the bullet to cement his legacy. You are choosing a living man over a living country. The Union needs its martyr." Suddenly, Vance's eyes snapped to the bag he had dropped on the floor. He kicked out wildly, sending the bag skidding. A second later, a small, dark object rolled out from the bag and came to rest near the hand press. A duplicate of the oval mahogany mirror. The sight of it sent a fresh wave of terror through Elias. Vance had his own reflection, his own tool for meddling with time. This explained how he had made the earlier intervention that had diminished Lincoln's political role. Vance saw the fear in Elias's eyes and smirked. He lunged for his mirror. "You may stop the telegram, Thorne, but you cannot stop this." Elias scrambled, reaching the mirror first. It was identical to his own, radiating the same unnatural, sickly cold. He knew the risk, but he also knew this was the only way to stop Vance from making another, more catastrophic move. He had to destroy the mirror. But as he raised his foot, Vance shrieked, "Wait! If you destroy it, you'll be trapped here. Your own mirror is the only way back." Elias hesitated. If he smashed the glass, he would be stranded in 1861, a man whose very existence was a historical anomaly, and Vance would be free to use his own methods to continue his dangerous, misguided attempts to save Lincoln. The young printer, oblivious to the metaphysical war being waged on his floor, finally looked up from his press, annoyed. "Gentlemen, I cannot work with this disturbance. State your business or leave my shop at once." The moment of distraction was all Vance needed. He headbutted Elias, breaking his hold. Vance sprang to his feet, snatching up his mirror and the piece of paper containing the unsent telegram. He sprinted out the door and into the street. "Stop him!" Elias yelled, scrambling up. He was too late. Vance was gone, swallowed by the early D.C. morning mist. Elias was left with the chilling knowledge that the two timelines, the tragic but unified one and the successful but fractured one, were in direct, violent competition. Vance was out there, trying to save Lincoln's life. Elias was left with the task of protecting Lincoln's destiny, which, in a grotesque paradox, required him to protect the assassination. Stranded in 1861, Elias's historical knowledge was his only weapon. He knew the true, original events of the next 4 years intimately. He had to get to Washington, D.C., find Vance, and find his own way home. He was living the most intense chapter of the history he had only ever read. The journey was a slow, agonizing process of stagecoaches and trains, all filled with men discussing the burgeoning Civil War. He arrived in Washington, D.C., a city in the throes of wartime paranoia. He spent days tracking Vance, his search focused on the man's known historical connections, Lincoln's inner circle. Elias finally located Vance's lodgings, a small, rented room in a boarding house near the Capitol. He forced the lock. The room was sparsely furnished, but in the center of the mantel stood the second mahogany oval mirror. Elias rushed to it, relieved to have found his way back. But he stopped short. Lying on the desk was a single sheet of paper, a note written in Vance's looping script. "Thorne, I know you will follow. You are correct. The man must live to be shot. The tragedy is the sacrifice required. I have failed to save his life from the bullet, and I have failed to prevent the war. I have made my final attempt. I have given him the only thing that can protect him from the final tragedy, the only thing that can guarantee his survival in 1865. The mirror will bring you back, but you will find the final cost is the greatest irony." Elias felt a cold dread. Vance hadn't given up. He had made one final move, one last attempt to save Lincoln. But what could he have given him that would save his life without destroying the Union? Suddenly, a loud, urgent commotion started outside. Shouts, the ringing of a church bell, and the panicked voice of the landlady downstairs. The president's carriage has been attacked." Elias ran to the window. In the distance, a small crowd had gathered. He could see the wreckage of a carriage and the frantic movements of soldiers. He was too late. Vance had succeeded in creating a distraction, a plot that would force Lincoln to stay in Washington, but the timing was off. Vance was still manipulating events, but the assassination was not the target. It was the decision-making of the president. He turned back to the mirror, ignoring the chaos outside. He had to go back to his own time, to his own mirror, and check the damage. He reached out and smashed his fist directly into the glass. The mirror shattered with a deafening, silvery crack. The room twisted and turned, and the sounds of 1861 rushed away in a violent vortex. He reappeared, staggering, back in his familiar study. The room was intact, but his own mirror was gone, replaced by a large, gaping hole in the wall, jagged shards of glass littered on the floor. He looked at his hand. It was scraped and bleeding from the impact. The familiar DC of the 1830s was back, but with a profound, final silence. He felt completely alone, the last custodian of a memory that was now, truly, a ghost. Elias stumbled out of his study, his heart pounding with fear and anticipation. He was back in his own time, but the world felt thin, fragile. Vance's last note had promised a final, ironic cost. He had to find out what Vance had given Lincoln. He ran to the archives. He didn't check the date or the Civil War. He went straight to the presidential records of Abraham Lincoln. He pulled out the file he knew by heart, the assassination. The file was thin, the text faint. Elias read with agonizing slowness. The events of April 14th, 1865, were still there. Ford's Theater, the play Our American Cousin, John Wilkes Booth entering the box. But the final act was different. As Booth raised his Derringer pistol, an object on the president's person deflected the bullet. Lincoln survived, receiving only a minor, non-fatal flesh wound to the shoulder. Booth was still captured and later killed, but the ultimate tragedy was averted. Lincoln lived. Elias sank onto a bench, a wave of relief washing over him, quickly followed by the cold dread of the irony. Vance had saved his life. He had succeeded, but at what cost? He looked to the text to find the object that had saved the president's life. The account was maddeningly vague, referring only to a thick, leather-bound volume carried in the president's breast pocket. Elias searched the inventory of preserved artifacts. An entry was there, marked with a red ink stamp. The Protector. The description followed, a small, worn, leather-bound book, believed to have been carried by the president on the night of the shooting, its pages pierced by a .44 caliber bullet, the slug lodged within its spine. The book is an anthology of Shakespeare's great tragedies. But then, Elias found a second, attached inventory tag, faint and almost illegible, in Vance's script. It had been added much later. It listed the book's true identity, discovered only after the president's death years later from natural causes. The book was not Shakespeare, but an unknown, hand-bound copy of the Unsent Eulogy of Stephen A. Douglas. Vance, stranded in 1861, had found the original manuscript of the eulogy, bound it into a book, and somehow, in the chaos of the time stream, ensured it was placed in Lincoln's possession before 1865. The very eulogy whose delivery Vance had desperately tried to prevent, the very speech that would have cemented Lincoln's early authority, was what ultimately saved his life. This was the grand irony. Lincoln's life was saved by the physical form of the great act of statesmanship he was forced to forego. Vance had finally secured a living Lincoln, but the country had to pay for it. The bullet had been stopped by the paper that represented his loss of political authority in 1861. Elias flipped the page, looking for the consequences. The Union won the Civil War. Slavery was abolished. But the text noted a different atmosphere, a different legacy. Lincoln, the unshot president, was not the martyr. He served out his full second term, a powerful but increasingly embattled figure, criticized for his slow, cautious approach to Reconstruction. The Union survived, but the national soul was not healed as profoundly as Elias knew it should have been. The final act of national tragedy had been replaced by a slow, divisive political struggle. The healing fire of martyrdom was gone, replaced by the friction of slow, tedious compromise. Elias stood in the silent, familiar archives, the custodian of a vanished truth. Lincoln was saved, the Union was whole, but the history was muted, a slightly lesser echo of the grand narrative Elias had dedicated his life to. He had completed his journey, the loop was closed, and the two timelines had converged on a flawed but stable future. The mirror was gone, its influence spent. Or was it? He walked back to his study, to the hole in the wall where his mirror had hung. The shards of glass from his mirror, scattered on the floor, were now nothing more than broken fragments of a window pane. But as he bent to sweep them, he saw something tucked into the crack where the frame had been. It was a small, perfectly preserved circular piece of the reflective glass, no bigger than a gold coin. It was from the center of the mirror, the focal point. Elias picked it up. It was cold, unnaturally so, even colder than the full mirror had been. He held it to the light, and his own agitated face stared back. Then, the reflection flickered. It showed not a different time, but a different Elias Thorne. An older version of himself, his eyes strained and weary, sitting at a desk that looked exactly like the one he was sitting at now. This older Elias was surrounded by books and files, and he was working on a manuscript. The title was clear: The Unshot President, The Life and Legacy of Abraham Lincoln, a full two-term president. The reflection showed the life he would live now, a historian of a different, less tragic history. His great work would be the story of a flawed but successful president, not a martyr. He was a historian of a world he did not believe in, a world he had helped to create. He looked closer at the older Elias in the reflection. The older man finished writing a line and leaned back in his chair, sighing. Then, the older man's eyes snapped up, directly meeting Elias's gaze through the small glass disc. The older Elias smiled, a strange, weary, knowing smile. He then lifted his hand and began to tap a pattern on his desk. Tap, 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 tap. It was Morse code. Elias, the historian, knew it immediately. He read the message as the older man's fingers moved. The older Elias was asking, "Who knows the truth?" Elias stared into the reflection, his heart pounding. The answer was a terrifying certainty. In a world where Lincoln lived, where Vance had succeeded, and where the original mirror was gone, the only person who knew the true, tragic, beautiful history of the martyred president was Elias Thorne himself. For everyone else, it was normal. For Elias, it was the gaping silence where a bullet's echo should have been. He was a ghost in his own time. He realized the full, final irony Vance had warned him about. Vance had saved Lincoln's life, but in doing so, he had doomed Elias to a life as the sole custodian of a greater, vanished truth. Elias was the last living link to the history the world had chosen to forget. He was the only one who knew the true cost of the Union. He pocketed the small piece of glass. It was a new tool, a secret knowledge. The reflections were not gone. They were contained. Dr. Elias Thorne lived out the rest of his days as a well-respected, if somewhat obscure, historian in Washington, D.C. The world continued to turn. The Civil War was won, and the name Abraham Lincoln remained on the rolls of great presidents. Elias published his treatise on the unshot president, and it was a moderate success. He wrote of the man's wisdom, his political battles, and his eventual, quiet death in 1872, an old man weary of the world. He never wrote about the assassination that didn't happen, the conspiracy he knew, or the mirror that had stolen his reality. He found Arthur Davies once more, years later. Arthur was older, his memory now entirely fixed on the new, stable timeline. "Elias," Arthur said, shaking his hand, "I must congratulate you. Your early devotion to Lincoln, when he was just a minor figure, was prophetic. You saw the greatness that others missed." Elias merely smiled a tired smile. "I saw more than greatness, Arthur. I saw necessity." His only constant companion was the small, circular piece of reflective glass. He kept it tucked into his vest pocket, and sometimes, late at night, in the quiet of his study, he would take it out. He would hold it to the faint gaslight, and it would show him two things. First, it showed him his own reflection, the old, tired historian, living a lie, burdened by a truth no one would ever believe. Second, it would flicker and show him a world that was not this one. A world where, on the night of April 14, 1865, a gunshot rang out in Ford's Theater, silencing a great man but galvanizing a nation. A world of intense tragedy and profound, unifying purpose. One night, an old man now, Elias was sitting in his chair, his eyesight failing. He held the small, cold disc. The reflection was of a new historian, a young man, in a future D.C. museum, standing before a preserved, bullet-pierced copy of a book, the Unsent Eulogy. The young historian was giving a lecture on how fate had a sense of humor, using the very book Lincoln had written to save his life. The young historian paused and looked up, directly into the lens of the coin-sized glass. His face was full of an intense, familiar curiosity. "And yet," the young historian said, his voice echoing in Elias's memory, "you have to wonder, when a history is so carefully preserved, what great, terrible truth had to be forgotten to make it so perfect." Elias's breath caught. The young man, in the future, was questioning the reality Elias had created. The truth, it seemed, could not be completely erased. It survived in the heart of the great irony. The loss of the unifying myth had left a cold void in the nation's soul. Elias closed his eyes, the small piece of glass falling onto his chest. He died that night, the last man who knew what a terrible, beautiful price had been paid for the survival of the American Union. His secret went with him, buried in the silence of his unwritten epilogue. But the small, cold disc, the final, persistent reflection, was never found. It simply vanished, waiting for another hand, another life, another time, to show a world that should have been. The Lincoln reflection was gone, but the memory of the bullet remained, a small, cold spot in the heart of history. A man saves a life and loses a legacy. A nation is spared a bullet but loses its most unifying myth. Elias Thorne's journey into the Lincoln reflection proved that history isn't just a record of what happened, but a delicate balance of sacrifice and consequence. And sometimes, the only way to save the country is to allow the tragedy. The true question that lingers is this: if you knew the cost, would you choose the living man or the unifying martyr? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. Which history do you believe America needed more? If you were gripped by Elias's struggle through the shifting timelines, don't forget to like this story, comment with your answer, and subscribe to our channel for more journeys into the unwritten chapters of history. Until next time, be careful what you look at in the dark.